Okay, let me start by mentioning what I think to be the really greatest single article in economics that was written in the 20th century, and that is this article written by Ludwig von Mises, Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth, written in 1920. Not only did it completely destroy the intellectual case for socialism, but it also, at the same time, was a major contribution to the understanding of the nature and function of the price system. Why a price system was essential to a civilized society. So it was a leap forward, like all good Austrian theory, both in theory, but at the same time, there were immediate implications for policy. Okay. So this article by Mises, as we'll see, really began what was called the socialist calculation debate. I might draw your attention to there's a remarkable epilogue to this work. It's written by a very prominent contemporary Austrian, and it's entitled "Why a Socialist Economy is Impossible," quote unquote. I actually wrote that. But before I had written that, when I sent it to Murray Rothbard, he had said, "You've actually proved to me that a socialist economy is impossible," and that was exactly what Mises meant. He says, even I, Murray Rothbard, in my deepest heart, didn't think that a socialist economy was impossible. I just thought it was extremely inefficient and it would eventually break down. So what I try to do in that epilogue, if you'll see, is to boil down Mises' argument and show that it implies that a socialist economy is not only just grossly inefficient or likely to break down, but it is in a non-trivial sense, in a true sense, it's impossible. Okay. Before Mises wrote, before his argument, there had been, in the early 19th century, a number of writers called utopian socialists. And the utopian socialists all put forth their own individual plans for a prosperous humanity. The three most famous utopian socialists were Charles Fourier, Henri Saint-Simon, and Robert Owen. The first two were French, the last was Scottish, who had immigrated to the United States. They all had their own ideas on how their particular plan would transform human society into a prosperous commonwealth in which people would have to do very little work, or if they did work, they would enjoy their work, and so on. Let me just give you Charles Fourier's idea. Charles Fourier believed that society should be segmented into what he called phalanstères, which is based on the Roman phalanx. That is 1,600 people, men, women, and children, living communally. Okay, that was the number. Where did he get the number? Well, out of his own fevered brain. These guys were all crazy. He also told us that once the socialist utopia was established, things would change physically too. He actually said that you would have the oceans would eventually turn into lemonade, and that roasted chickens would fly right into your plate. This is in his writings. I'm not, it's shocking, but and he said that the lions would present themselves to human beings to be ridden through the fields. Okay, so they were basically crazy, and they were an embarrassment to the socialist movement. Now, the classical economists, even with their primitive supply and demand, or it wasn't so primitive, their idea of supply and demand, basic supply and demand mechanism, showed how all of these plans were just ridiculous, and that they would never come to fruition in the real world. Now, what Marx did, Marx established scientific socialism. He was embarrassed by the utopian socialists, even though he was influenced by them. But he's embarrassed by their arguments. He had seen that the classical economists had destroyed the intellectual foundations of their plans for humanity. And what he did was to devise an ingenious rhetorical ploy. What he said was the following. He says, if you're a scientific socialist, what you understand is the following, that socialism will replace capitalism, whatever we think about the future, and it will do so inexorably. It's like a law of nature. Just like capitalism was destined to replace feudalism, and feudalism was destined to replace the slave society of ancient Greece and Rome, so it is that socialism, that capitalism is doomed because of its inner contradictions to result in a socialist future. Anyone who tries to predict the socialist future is unscientific. Right? So that shut everybody up. Because no one wanted to be seen as unscientific. So what it did was it stopped all these utopian socialists from talking about what the future would look like. Okay, this was the law of nature. It was coming, whatever we thought, whatever we wrote about it. So Marx himself, his great works, his three-volume work was called Capital. It was a criticism of capitalism. He never really wrote about the future social society. He wrote a little, there's some insights here and there, some hints about what he thought it would look like. But he knew that once you tried to set it out, then you opened yourself to the critiques of economists. Now, the basic debate before Mises wrote was in simple terms, who's going to take out the garbage under socialism? That was the debate. It was on that level. It was also on the level of justice. Okay, whether or not collectivizing or nationalizing the means of production was just. Okay. Whether or not the distribution of income under socialism was more just than it was under capitalism. So there was that part of the debate. The only the economics involved was whether or not socialism could solve the incentive problem, could give people the incentive to go to work and to produce goods and services. When, in fact, everybody would get, according to Marx, would produce according to his ability, and the goods would be distributed according to the needs of everyone. Or even if it was an equal distribution. Why should anyone go down in coal mines and risk their health and work in a dank environment? Why would anybody under socialism for the same pay get up early in the morning at 4 o'clock and take out the garbage? Okay. The only answer the socialists had to this was, well, under socialism, human nature would be transformed. A new socialist man would emerge. Okay. But so it was a kind of a low-level debate, though, again, the classical economists got the better of it. So in 1920, actually in 1919, he gave a paper that became the book that I was talking about. Mises wrote an article that completely destroyed the intellectual foundations for socialism. And his thesis was very, very simple. He said, under a socialist society, all the means of production would be owned by a monopoly central planning board. Which means that there would be no prices. If all the factories and capital goods and natural resources were all owned by the same group, well then there would be no exchange. With no exchange, there would be no prices. There would be no prices of the inputs into the production process. Okay? Without prices of inputs, the socialists, let's call it the Central Planning Board, could never calculate its cost of production. Even if you allowed exchange of consumer goods, you would have prices of consumer goods, but you would never have prices of capital goods and of factories and so on. So you would never know if producing a certain good and not producing another good was more or less profitable. Socialism, as Mises said, was planned chaos, because it could never calculate the cost of production of any line of production. And I'll go into that in more detail. What Mises said was, in fact, therefore, economic calculation, allocating goods to their most urgent uses, could never exist under socialism. Or to put it another way, there could be never be a rational allocation of resources under socialism. He said, because, in fact, the preconditions, the things that you need for economic calculation were private ownership, not just in consumer goods, but in all goods, free exchange of all goods, including free exchange of shares of factories, stock market shares and so on, free exchange of raw materials and so on. The buying and selling in capital goods as well as of McDonald's hamburgers and shirts and CDs. You needed also the buying and selling of the things that were used to produce these things. Then you could compare output prices with resource prices. So you needed private property, free exchange, and a sound money. A sound money that was not continually fluctuating in value so that entrepreneurs could not calculate prices with any certainty. And he went on to point out, in fact, socialism abolishes these three preconditions. When all means of production are collectivized or socialized, you abolish private property, in capital goods, you abolish free exchange, because there is no exchange. There's one owner, okay, one will. Okay, you have to have many wills and many different sort of values and as we'll see, expectations in order to have exchange on markets. And you wouldn't have sound money. There would be no reason to have money. You would just give consumers some vouchers. You pay them in vouchers and they would go to the stores and they would buy whatever was produced. Okay? But there'd be no way to allocate all the resources. Take the American economy, for example. We have millions of different types of resources. How do you allocate them? How do you decide of all the infinite ways that we can use these resources to produce different goods with different technologies? How do you decide which of all of those ways are the most efficient? You cannot do it without prices. Now, that's all very abstract. Let me just give you an example of that. Very simple decision that a socialist planner could not make. Now, the problem is not scientific knowledge under socialism. They could hire scientists and engineers who would always give them the various technological ways of producing goods. So let's say they come up with this way, and forget about my writing in blue there, my scribbling. Just focus on the production of an automobile. Okay? So the engineer could tell the central planner that if you want to produce a particular automobile, you need P tons of steel, Q hours of machine time, R hours of unskilled labor, some hours of engineering labor, a quantity of factory space, certain kilowatt hours of electricity, and finally managerial labor. You add all those together and you combine them in the production process and you get one automobile. Okay? The question isn't whether socialism can produce a car. It's whether they know if they should produce a car or not, and if they do decide to produce a car, what's the cheapest way of producing a car? Okay? What's the cost of production of producing that automobile? Can we add up tons of steel, hours of machine time, hours of unskilled labor, so on and so forth, and get a unitary figure? Of course not, because you can't add apples and oranges. Okay? So the socialist would not know whether or not he should set up a factory to produce 100,000 cars per year. He would not know if the steel, the machine time, the engineering labor was better used in producing bicycles or motorcycles or building more houses for the comrades. He couldn't make his mind. He wouldn't know whether or not it was profitable or useful to build another automobile or another automobile factory, let's say. Okay? Now, there's another problem, a technological problem. We know today that you can build an automobile by hand, as was done up until about 1910, where one or a small group of craftsmen in a small bicycle shop, that's where the first automobiles were built, should get together and make all the parts themselves and then assemble the one automobile, and, each, okay, or together, assemble one automobile. Or whether we should produce like we produce today, where we have a labor and capital, or if we should produce, as the Japanese are doing in many plants, with a completely robotized factory, a factory that's run by robots, and there's a few people who control the computers. So you have, in other words, should we have more machines? That is, should we add to the Q hours A hours of machine time and make the factory almost completely robotically run, and therefore decrease the amount of labor? Is that a more efficient way of building automobiles? They don't know. They don't know if the costs go up or down when they do that. Okay? You can always substitute more machines for labor and get the same amount of automobiles. Or should we go to make automobiles by hand, pretty much, without much capital, as we did in the 1890s? They would never know the correct answer there. Do we know that answer under capitalism? Of course we do. Because steel is privately owned, machines are privately owned, factory spaces are privately owned, electricity is privately owned. It's all traded on markets. So now we can look at the bottom there. If in fact it costs, if the entrepreneur has to bid against all the other entrepreneurs that are producing all the other things in the economy, $18,000 to get all of those resources and combine them, and if he expects to get $21,000 for the automobile, then in fact we know that's an efficient decision. Why? Because those various resources are worth about $18,000 in producing other things in the economy. All other things, the next best uses in the economy are worth $18,000 to consumers. That's why the other entrepreneurs will only bid up to $18,000. And that's why he can basically get those resources for $18,000. Now what is he doing with them? He's taking those resources, he's combining them, and then he's producing a product that's worth $21,000 to consumers. So what is he doing? He's allocating resources, moving them from lower valued uses to higher valued uses. Okay. To take a more radical example, a number of years ago there was the phenomenon of the pet rock. I think it was in the 1980s or something like that. Does anyone remember that? There was a kid who became a millionaire by coming up with the idea of a pet that wasn't messy, that didn't need to be taken out all the time, that didn't bother you when you didn't want to be bothered. It was a rock. Okay, a rock that he picked up off the ground. Other people saw no value in that rock. He saw a $10 pet. So, with his marketing costs and so on, he sold these, let's say, at $2. I don't remember the price. Rather, his costs were $2, and let's say he sold them for $10. He made an $8 profit. What did he do? He took resources worth $2, he combined them into a product that was worth $10. Now, what if entrepreneurs make mistakes, as Ford has? I mentioned yesterday that Ford lost $8.6 billion last quarter. What does that imply? It implies that they took resources, let's say, now we'll use red to show the losses. Ford paid, let's say, $22,000 per SUV, and let's make it more, let's say $32,000 per SUV, and sold them for $28,000. Okay? So this is the cost of production. This is the price. Ford made a mistake. Okay? That is, Ford used resources that were worth $32,000 to consumers. They had a bid for these resources in markets, and they sold them at $28,000, which means that consumers did not value the car as urgently as the other things that could have been produced by those resources. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that they're irrational in some sense, that they're not able to calculate? No. In all systems, we always have uncertainty. Now, when you build a car, you are making a decision 5 years in advance. It generally takes 5 years to bring a model from the drawing board to the dealer's showroom. So to make a long story short, even when entrepreneurs make wrong decisions under capitalism, they know they've made wrong decisions. Now, what is Ford doing? It's feverishly shutting down factories in the U.S., getting rid of labor and releasing steel and everything else in those areas of SUVs and trucks and so on, where the value is less than the cost of production. So the point is that they immediately begin adjusting in a way that's dictated by consumer demand. Now, is there any way for the socialist planner to know whether or not they're making a mistake? No, they don't know. Okay, it's without the cost of production, there's no way to know. Now, I have a friend that I grew up with, this woman, who lives in Montana. I like to give this example. A number of years ago, she lives on a big ranch. She married a cowboy, a real cowboy. They actually have cattle, and they have cattle drives and everything. But in any case, so she lives on a big ranch in Montana. You know, there's about 15 people in Montana. And so one day she said, I just bought a new house. He said, oh, you moved from the ranch? And she says, no. She said, I traded in the old house. I said, what are you talking about? She said, well, out here, houses are built modularly in factories in Nebraska. She said they just took apart the old house and they brought in pieces by railroad and by truck, and they put them together. They assembled them here in Montana. Now, why would they do that? Certainly, from where I come from in the Northeast, all houses are built on site, right? Why? Because in the Northeast, there's a lot of labor. The labor can be easily transported. It's very densely populated. Labor can easily be transported to the spot where the houses have to be built. Okay? So it's cheaper to do it that way. However, in Montana, it's cheaper to build houses with a lot of machinery in big factories at a great distance, and then to incur the cost of transportation, and then to use a little bit of labor, because there's hardly anybody in Montana use some local labor to simply put them together. Okay? Now, could a socialist planner ever in his wildest dreams figure that out? No. How did the entrepreneurs that built the modular housing factory in Nebraska figure that out? They figured that out by looking at costs and prices, what the expected prices are. Now, no one ever knows exactly what prices and revenues they're going to get. Okay? But they can always look at the market and see the costs of producing. And if they feel, believe, expect, anticipate that the prices of what they're going to be selling is higher than the cost of production, they will then engage in that line of production. Okay? They will reject all those lines of production in which they believe that it's going to cost them more to produce the good than they can receive in revenue. Okay? And that's not only good for them because they earn profits when they act that way and avoid losses. It's good for you and I. Because what they're doing is they're taking lower valued resources and using them in higher valued uses. That is, resources are being used or being wasted before they step in and say, you know what, there's a better use for this steel and this labor and so on, instead of making large automobiles and trucks. Now, one thing that Mises did say was the following. He pointed out that it is possible with a small, simple economy to operate without economic calculation. So he made a distinction. He said, there's a difference between valuation and calculation. Valuation is what we do every day when we decide, for example, that we're going to make ourselves a ham sandwich instead of a tuna sandwich. When we're not in the market, we're simply comparing what we would like better. So we use our bread and our labor and so on to make the ham sandwich because that's higher on our value scale than, let's say, the tuna sandwich. So for certain very short and simple production processes, you can substitute direct valuation of goods for economic calculation. Calculation always uses cardinal numbers, that is, prices. So an example I might give you is the following. Let's say, let's go back to Robinson Crusoe. Say that Robinson Crusoe is on his island, and this is his value scale. Okay, he has 12 hours of labor. Let's say he works 12 hours, the other 12 hours he has to rest. Okay. So he divides his labor, and then this should be 3 here. Divides the 12 hours in 3 hour unit, or actually, all right, let's make it 16, make it easier, because I have 4 hours. So he can allocate his labor in 4 hour units among his most important wants. So for 4 hours, he gets a stick and knocks coconuts out of a tree, and he produces 4 coconuts. The next 4 hours, he fishes. Okay. In the third, he picks wild mushrooms so he can make the fish taste better and so on. And then for the 4th hour, if he's southern, he just fries the fish. Okay. And for the 4th hour, he picks a sack of berries every day, for the 4th unit of 4 hours because he wants to make, let's say, wine. Okay. To have that with his dinner. Okay. Now he suddenly recognizes a new opportunity. He says, you know what? There's a rabbit. I see that there's rabbits on this island, and that I can hunt them, and in 4 hours I can catch a rabbit. The point is, does it cost him too much to devote 4 hours to catching the rabbit? Well, it's easy to compare. He doesn't need prices, because he's directly producing for himself, and it's a very simple process. All he does is say to himself, well, if I take 4 hours out of the 12 hours and devote it to a rabbit, the cost of producing that rabbit is the fact that I have to forego the lowest valued good on my value scale, which is what? The berries for the wine. Okay? So he can directly make comparisons. Okay? Directly make comparisons. Now put Robinson Crusoe in charge of the United States economy. Okay? Or let's take a Star Trek example, which there was an episode in which a computer ran an entire planet, fed the people, made all the decisions about what to produce. I remember, and Kirk shuts it down for some reason because the people are getting sort of becoming less than human or some crap like that. So it's one of those typical. They're great, but they're so hokey. So anyway, let's say Robinson Crusoe and his family has access to all the resources in the United States, okay, and he has robots that will do all the work for him. And we have to assume that these resources are scarce, okay? And he can build himself castles, he can build himself, he have the robots build fast cars, airplanes, and so on. Would Robinson Crusoe be able to only get along with valuation in that case? No. The processes are so complicated. There are so many capital goods. There's an infinite way of combining all the different resources we now have in the United States. This is the precise problem. It's not just socialist planners. It's even a single person or family that tries to engage in very, very complex production processes. It's impossible without cardinal numbers. Okay? He'd be able to live, obviously, and be very wealthy, but he could not allocate all his resources rationally. All right? Okay, so Mises says that, or doesn't deny, that in a very simple economy, what he calls a household economy, or a primitive tribe, they could more or less, allocate resources in a way that serves their most urgent wants, or their highest valued wants. But once you become bigger than that, and the economy gets any more complex, and you begin to have a lot of capital goods, then you need prices. And then you need more than one will. Okay, Mises actually talks about, there's a quote from him, the problem of socialism is the problem of one will acting. Because when you have one will, everything's owned by that person, so there's no exchange, there's no markets, and there's no prices. All right? Whether, again, it's Robinson Crusoe, or whether it's a socialist central planning board, there's only one will acting. Even if it's a group of people, they're acting as in concert, as one. All right? So that was his basic argument against socialism, that there can be no economic calculation. So what he concluded was that socialist economy is literally impossible because it cannot calculate opportunity costs of production. Okay? In producing a car factory or in deciding to build a huge housing project, it does not know if it's using resources correctly. It does not know if the car factory should be built or the housing project. There's no way to know which is the more important use. And then when you begin to bring in the fact that they can use these resources to produce hundreds of thousands of things, and millions of things, in many different technological ways, then it just becomes impossible. It's just simply planned chaos. Mises says that it's like being in the middle of a desert, trying to get to a point in the fastest way, but having absolutely no compass. Okay? So you're completely in the dark. Right? And that's why he called it planned chaos. So socialist planning is an oxymoron. Okay? Because you can't plan without prices. All right, now let me give you some real world examples. There was a famine in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. It was interesting, travelers there were a number of books written about the Soviet Union by journalists, New York Times journalists, and a few others, during that period. And they observed rusting tractors. There were tractors, but they were sitting in the field rusting. Yet there was all of this unharvested grain. At the same time, people were starving. And there were empty silos. There were silos to store the grain. Okay, why did they harvest the grain? Because there were no laborers. The laborers were producing steel or something else. Okay, there was no way to allocate those resources rationally. So, and there was not enough diesel fuel. So they were producing too much of certain things and not enough of other things, and they had a famine, in a country in which you have a tremendous amount of very arable, cultivatable land. Okay, where the Ukraine used to be called the breadbasket of Europe. In fact, that was one of the reasons why Hitler marched towards Russia. They wanted to take the Ukraine, okay, and incorporate it into the German economy, or at least make it sort of an imperial province of Germany to feed the German people. Okay, they had a system called gross output planning, and in this system, which substituted for prices, what happened was that the Central Planning Board, which was called GOS Plan, okay, so there was a name for this board. GOS Plan would come up with a plan in which they would tell each industry how much of each good to produce, okay? And then the industry minister of that particular industry, steel, automobiles, whatever it is, would then tell each factory manager how much their quota was. So this was called gross output planning. It was stated in terms of the units of the goods itself. There were no prices involved. It should be output here. And what were the problems? What would you think the problems would be with that? First of all, they gave each factory a target. Now, if the manager did not meet his target consistently, well, then he got a free trip to the Gulag in Siberia. Okay? If he met his target and exceeded it somewhat, he would get a bonus, a nice bonus. Okay? But the problem was, if he consistently produced more than the target, what would happen? They would raise the target. Say, aha, you can produce more. So it was really a system of mutual lying. what they would do is they would say, we can't produce more than, 40 tons of nails, when they knew they could produce 60 tons. But since Gough's plan, or the planners knew that they were lying, the ministers knew they were lying, they would say, well, no, your target's 50. Okay? So they would lie to one another. And, because the incentive was that the manager wanted to just exceed his target and get a bonus, but not too much, because then they always raise it the next year if you exceeded the target. So, what happened there? Well, when you have gross output planning, you can specify the units that should be produced, but it's very hard to specify the exact quality and type of unit. So what we found in Russia was there were many unfinished houses throughout the country. They were completely built, except that they had no roofs. Why didn't they have any roofs? Because small roofing nails were not being produced. Why weren't small roofing nails being produced? Because the output target for the nail industry was specified in terms of tons. So everybody made really big nails, because it was easier to meet the target that way. And there was a famous joke in a Russian magazine, cartoon. I love this cartoon. I actually drew that. Okay. That's the People's Train. That's the guy on the right with the smaller hat, because he's lower down. He doesn't have that big that big fur hat that they wear in Russia, right? That's the minister of the industry. Matt Mahai, if he's here, also wears hats like this. So in any case, he's pointing to that nail and he's saying, well, comrade, I met my target. He produced one giant nail. Now, that's an exaggeration, but that's what gross output planning led to. There was a famous speech by Khrushchev, which got into the Western press, in which he began berating, during a party meeting, the chandelier producers. And why were they doing that? Well, it turned out that, I guess they're called dashas, these very expensive villas on the Black Sea where the apparatchiks, the communists, higher ups in the Communist Party, lived. They're being killed because the chandeliers were so heavy they were pulling down the ceilings and crushing people, when they were having feasts and stuff. Why was that? Well, because the production of chandeliers was specified in terms of pounds of chandeliers or tons of chandeliers or whatever the unit was. Okay? And when Western economists would go to Russia, they would hear the Russian, they would be kidding with their colleagues. And this goes back to something that Khrushchev, the premier at the time, in the 1950s, did at the United Nations. There's a famous story, and you may have seen I think I have it on film, where he's banging his shoe on the podium and saying, "We will bury you," meaning we will bury the West economically. Okay. Because our system is so much more productive. Obviously, he didn't read Mises' pamphlet. But in any case, the joke was, the Russian economists would tell the Western economists, we will bury you, but we're going to leave Hong Kong. Because we need at least some prices. Okay? We need some prices to calculate. So now it turned out, that Mises had been criticized, because he claimed that socialism was impossible. And yet, okay, this joke bears on the following. What people would say, well, look, the Soviet Union, has existed since 1917, it's the 1950s or 60s. How could, Mises was clearly wrong. There's still the Soviet Union in existence, and in fact, there's other socialist countries in existence. But what was very interesting was that Mises, in that very first article, said that the Soviet Union today, and that was written in 1920, is not a real socialist economy, because it exists in a sea of market prices, of world market prices. So they can roughly calculate, even though they're not the prices of their specific goods, they can roughly calculate the price of steel. They can roughly calculate the price of electricity. Especially in the case of things that are traded internationally, it's easy for them to observe those prices. So the Soviet Union itself engaged in foreign trade. Okay, basically the Soviet Union was just a giant corporation, monopoly corporation, that sold coal, gold, and oil, and gas on world markets. So it knew those prices. So we could use prices in a rough way, okay, not in the same way that a free market entrepreneur would. So the Soviet Union, Mises says, is like the post office, right? The post office is extremely inefficient in the United States, okay? But they can still calculate. They can still copy low-cost technology, which is what the Soviet Union did, okay, from outside the post office system. So as bad as the post office was, that's how bad the Soviet economy was. There's another thing that they did. There was a thoroughgoing black market system between Russian factories. Factories that were striving to meet their targets sometimes would run short of certain products or of certain inputs. So what they would do is that they would send out these sort of semi-black market dealers that would go and find what they needed and then trade excess materials that their factory had. So there'd be trading, and there would be market prices, at least in terms of goods, or even maybe in terms of rubles. So there'd be a whole system of bribes and black markets that was keeping the Soviet Union going. It was called BLAT, B-L-A-T, which was a system of bribes. Also, by the 1980s, Western goods were being smuggled in like crazy. Western jeans, for example, being smuggled in and sold in terms of dollars. They were going for $300. Beatles records were being smuggled in, and so on. So there was also this thriving black market. Also, the Soviet government allowed a very small, more or less free market agricultural sector. Okay, and that provided like something, like 2% of the agricultural land was private. People could have small gardens, but it produced like 30 or 40%. I forget the figures now of the goods. So there were prices there that they could look at and copy. There's also a story, I don't know how true this is, that in the 1950s, Maoist China was madly ordering Sears catalogs and Montgomery Ward catalogs so they could copy the prices. Okay. Yeah. So because they were blind, as Mises said, without prices. They were totally blind. What's interesting, of course, is that mainstream economists, even as late as the late 1980s, were saying that the Soviet Union was going to close the gap on us in terms of per capita income. And Paul Samuelson, who was, I think, won the second Nobel Prize in economics, and whose textbook was the leading textbook for many, many, many decades, from the early 1950s onward, had the following interesting diagram. I'll put it up there for you. Oops. Yeah, and zoom in on it. Okay. Tight. What this diagram, see that cone? See, this is a cone of the possible growth rates or likely growth rates of the U.S. from 1976 to 2005. Now, this was written in 1989, I believe. So what he's saying is that the per capita income of the USSR, okay, now the USSR cone is the darker cone. See it up there? There was a possibility that by 2005, their growth rate would be higher than the U.S. growth rate. I'm sorry, not growth rate, per capita income rate. They would be richer, okay, than the U.S. would be. And of course, they completely collapsed like a year or two later. And this, and by the way, a lot of this was based on CIA data. Okay, which is just nonsense. In fact, a friend of ours, Yuri Mulsov, who's a friend of the Institute, made the point that he calls himself the last defector because he got out right before the whole thing collapsed. Great entrepreneurship on his part. But for about 6 months, he was very popular. He was an economist that had escaped the Soviet Union. But what he said was that when they added up their GDP figures, they added up. Unlike the U.S., they would add the steel as well as the cars that the steel produced, whereas we would net the steel out because we would consider it double counting. So they would, and a lot of the steel and other things that were being produced, raw materials, were just piling up and never going into consumer goods. But that would be added up. So the CIA was saying, the country's getting stronger and, they're going to have more military might and so on. They were just bogus statistics. And in fact, Mises predicted this. He said, the machine, it's an irrational machine that just keeps turning and producing things that no one wants. Okay? Women's clothes, since it was under gross output planning, were all huge sizes. Petite women couldn't find decent dresses in Russia. Okay? So it was a mindless machine, just kept producing things, but nothing that people really wanted. And the things that people really did want, for example, if you saw the movie Moscow on the Hudson, people were lined up at the beginning of that movie, the Robin Williams movie. What were they lined up for? Well, they were lined up for toilet tissue. Okay? And it take a long time to get toilet tissue. And the joke was that a Westerner would see a Russian get on a very long line with no end in sight. You couldn't see what was at the end of the line, why people lined up, and so they would ask the Russian, why are you getting on this line? What's at the other end? The guy says, well, I don't know, but it must be good if it's a long line. Okay, because they were keeping the price of the scarcer and scarcer consumer goods very low to hide the fact that hardly any were being produced. Okay, so communism results really in the complete destruction of the capital structure. Now, it was very interesting. There was one period in which there was true communism in the world, and that was under war communism, and that was from about 1917 to 1921, where the planners completely ignored all prices. They tried to calculate or to do accounting in natural units, of course, which is impossible. And during that 4 years, the cities had emptied out. People were using burning furniture to keep warm. After their furniture was used up and all the food was gone from the cities, people were just going to the countryside, and you had roving bands of predators just going to various farms and stealing crops or living off the land in the forests. So basically, the Soviet or the Soviet model, central planning, leads ultimately to primitive conditions, just a society of roaming nomads. It thrusts humanity back to primitive times. Okay. They even used the houses for firewood. At the end, they were just burning parts of the houses. Now, Pol Pot in Cambodia realized that that was the end of socialism, so he did it right away, right? What did he do? He forced everybody out of the cities. Okay? And he murdered, millions in the course of that. But he forced everybody into the countryside, because that's what socialism ends up being anyway. Okay? Even the farmhouses and so on, they're all burned. So, socialism is a vampire economy. It eats itself. It destroys itself. Okay? And that's it's the name of a book about the Nazi economy too. The vampire economy. Because they also adopted central planning, even though they had nominally private property. But it was a centrally planned economy. And, we have that book. It's very interesting. And it shows how the Nazis told the owners of the plants what to produce, how to produce, what prices to charge, where to buy their inputs, and so on. And it's aptly named the vampire economy. Okay. Now let me just say a few words about what Mises calls the intellectual division of labor. I'll just say it very quickly. Basically, what Mises says is that everyone, all of us, as consumers, producers, owners, entrepreneurs, we're all involved in bringing about this price system that everyone can use to decide whether or not to produce in any conceivable production process. Okay? Every unit of every single good in a free market economy has a price. Every unit of every resource has a price. So we know profits and losses can always be calculated in all production processes. We know which are efficient and which are not efficient. Now again, because of uncertainty, there can be mistakes. But those mistakes are then revealed by the price system, by losses, and then they can be corrected. Okay? So just to give you an idea, Mises said that everyone, including, he used the word washerwoman, is involved in the intellectual division of labor. And what that is the following. Consumers, okay, look at the top, consumers' goods are evaluated by people's value scales, okay, and they have, in their minds when they go shopping, a maximum price that they'll pay for these various quantities of consumer goods, okay? In the middle of all this is the entrepreneur, and let me just make this a little bit tighter, wider rather. And at the end is the resource prices, okay? Now, the people who own the resources, who own the labor, who own the natural resources and so on, who own the capital goods, those people then also have in mind how much they will sell those things to the entrepreneur for. The entrepreneur is a key actor, but not the only actor. What the entrepreneur does is he looks at the future. Okay, so someone who's going to produce an automobile is not looking at the price of automobiles today. He uses that information, that experience, I call it here, but he uses it to forecast what the future market's going to be. So Stephen Jobs, for example, when he started Apple from his garage, he forecast that people were eventually going to want, and even businesses would use, smaller computers. IBM, Bob Watson, in the early 1980s, basically poo-pooed the idea, and he said they had the technology for PCs first, IBM did, but they said, you know what, Watson is quoted as saying, this is just going to be a child's toy. It's just going to be used to play computer games and so on, or for some household accounting. It will never be used in the future. What happened? We know that the PCs were then really just, pretty much pushed out mainframes. And IBM almost went out of business completely, okay? And they're a much smaller player today than they were then. So the good entrepreneurs can forecast the future. They buy resources at prices that they think are undervalued, and then they sell them, or they combine them into a product that they believe that they'll be paid higher prices for. Okay? And if they're correct, they earn profits. If they're wrong, they suffer losses. Mises' whole point was this. This process is what allows us to come up with the cost of production. The entrepreneurs, based on what they think consumers will pay for different products, bid money for resources owned by private people, and that brings about a whole structure of prices. And he called that the social appraisement process. It's a fancy word. All it means is that it takes all of society, all of the interaction between various buyers and sellers at every stage of the process to give us this structure. And what Mises emphasizes is that this is a social outcome. It's a social outcome in the following sense. Everyone participates in it, but no one mind can create a price structure. Okay? So we all are involved in the intellectual division of labor. Okay, let me now just talk about how the socialists responded to all this. One of the earliest socialist responses to Mises' argument, and it was right away, it was taken seriously. People recognized that this was an argument to be reckoned with. The earliest responses were from German economists, and who were pretty much socialists. They weren't really trained economists, and they gave a number of responses to Mises that Mises had already dealt with in the initial article. The first was, well, yes, accounting is important, and comparing costs and prices is very important, but we can do that under socialism. We'll do it with in natura, or in-kind calculation. So this was put forth by a fanatical Marxist, Otto Neurath. And what he said was that we'll do accounting in natural units. So this idiot thought you could add up tons of steel, kilowatts of electricity, and so on, and compare it directly to the automobile. Okay? So Mises had already dealt with this. He said, obviously you need a common denominator before you can do accounting, and that has to be money. Okay? So that he already had dealt with that. Other economists, a little more sophisticated, but not much more, said, well, you know what? Labor hours will be used. So what we'll do is all accounting in terms of a common denominator, labor hours. So those goods that have more labor hours, obviously, will have higher prices. All right? So we'll base it on the prices of inputs on labor hours. But of course, Mises had pointed out earlier that labor itself is heterogeneous. How do you compare the hour of, let's say, a McDonald's cashier with an hour of labor of a software engineer with an hour of labor of a brain surgeon? There's no way. They're heterogeneous, just like apples and oranges. That's number one. So you can't add up labor hours. Number two, it leaves out the fact that the same labor is more productive if he or she is working with more and better capital goods. So you're not talking, so some goods could have more capital, okay? Which means that the laborer will produce more with more capital. So you're leaving out of account capital goods if you just focus on labor hours. And the same thing is true with land, okay? The more land you use in agriculture for a given labor force, the more productive each laborer will be. So Mises pointed out that even in the same industry, doing the same jobs, laborers can differ. For example, compare, Kobe Bryant as a basketball player, his hour of labor on the court to the hour of labor of the 12th man sitting at the end of the bench. It's heterogeneous. You can't compare it. Okay? So labor is not a common denominator, as Mises had already pointed out. Finally, the most sophisticated socialists in this period of the 1920s responded, you know what? There is no problem. We'll just tell, on the last day of capitalism, that night, when we take over, we'll tell them, we'll get the managers together of all the firms, we'll say, do exactly what you've been doing all along. We'll do that. Okay? Okay. All right, now that's okay if people are robots whose values never change, who never come up with new ideas for technology, who never find new sources of raw materials. So in other words, what they're looking at is a static economy. If things go on forever, of course you're going to do the same things every day. But that's not the problem that a free market solves. What a free market solves The problem that it solves is the fact that it's continually moving resources away from those areas where demand is going down and into those areas where demand is going up, or away from those areas where technology is outmoded and into those areas where you're getting lower cost technology implemented. So sure, it's not a problem in a static economy, in a world where everybody's a robot and nothing ever changes. Okay? So Mises said, however, in a dynamic economy that's in constant disequilibrium, where everything is the economic data are changing, consumer values, technology, and resources, you continuously need feedback of profits and losses to tell entrepreneurs what to do next. Okay? Not only that, entrepreneurs are forward-looking, so they're not only thinking about what to do next for tomorrow, they're thinking about what to do next for 5 years from now. Because if everybody just thought about tomorrow, then you would be losing a lot of efficiency by not adapting your plan to the future. So those were easily dealt with by Mises. Okay. The more sophisticated responses came from neoclassically trained economists in the English-speaking world in the 1930s. Actually, not just also this argument came out of Italy with Vilfredo Pareto and Enrico Barone, two Italian economists who were not socialists. And what they did was they set up a system of equations that embodied consumer values, technology, production functions, and scarcities of resources, and a system of supply and demand equations, basically. Now they came up with Pareto developed it was a small economy, and what he said was that if you have the information to fill into these equations, okay, about consumer demands and so on, then you can solve them, and the solution will give you the correct prices and quantities of all goods that should be produced. But what Pareto pointed out was that even in a small economy, there'd be 69,000 equations for I don't know, I forget how big the economy was supposed to be, but it would. He said basically. You won't be able to solve these equations. You won't be able to get the knowledge for them. So he sort of threw that aside. But later on, I mean, that was in late 19th century. That was in the late 19th century or so. And so later on, other British economists came up. They came up with the solution again. They said, you know what? Mises was already refuted because we can use simultaneous equations to solve these problems. Okay. We'll get the information, we'll put them into the equation system, and then we'll get the right prices and quantities, and we won't have any monopoly, and we won't have any other problems that we have with advertising or anything. We'll just have the right prices, right quantities. We'll be more efficient. All right, so that was called the mathematical solution, and let me just deal with the second solution, which is also pretty sophisticated, the trial and error method of market socialism. Okay, and there was an American named Fred M. Taylor, a Pole named Oscar Lange who studied at Chicago, who was a communist but also a neoclassically trained economist, and a British economist, Abel Lerner. And basically what they said was the following. We can imitate the market, and we can get rid of the inefficiencies of the market by simply having a trial and error process in which we tell, the Central Planning Board will set prices. We'll set prices of consumer goods, we'll set prices of producer goods. And when we do that, they will have input decisions based on these prices. We'll tell them, just act as if these prices are real prices. Now, if the demand for a good exceeded the supply, then the Central Planning Board would raise the price. If the demand for the good was less than supply, that meant that the price was too high, they would lower the price. So they'll find the right prices, and then the businessmen will calculate, the socialist managers will calculate on the basis of those prices, and they'll produce goods in the same way that the market does, but without any sort of inefficiency, any sort of monopoly. Okay. Well, there's a number of responses to this. Lionel Robbins and Friedrich Hayek, who are sort of students of Mises on this question, came up and said, look, the mathematical solution, there are real problems with that. The economic data are widely scattered. It's very difficult to find out people's value scales and so on. Okay. So that's going to be difficult. But even if you could find that information, solving the equations in the pre-computer era, the millions of equations that you'd need to solve would prove to be impossible. Okay. And third, they said, even if you could solve a system of equations, the data are continually changing every day. We know that market prices are changing minute by minute in the real world, right? So by the time you did solve the equations, they would be irrelevant to today. They would be relevant to whenever you collected the data 5 years ago or 2 years ago or a few months ago. What did they say about the competitive solution of market socialism? Well, Hayek claimed that, well, this is pretty insightful, but he pointed out that there were two problems. How rapidly is a central planning board going to change prices? It can't change it minute to minute like the market would. It's going to take days or months for them to change these prices and get the information to the factories. Okay? So that's one thing. The second thing they said was that the price changes would not embody all the information, because there's a lot of information that managers and entrepreneurs know that cannot be put in the form of statistics and sent to the central planner. So that was, they said that, well, maybe socialism sort of could calculate, but it would be very inefficient. Mises had an even stronger critique later on. Basically, and I'll end with this, Mises said that the mathematical method will only give you equilibrium. In the real world, you have to know at every moment how to change all the capital goods that are wearing out. Take the United States. These capital goods have been built up over the last 50 years, and they're continually wearing out. So what you have to do to get to the situation where you should be is to use them in the best way possible. They're not right. There's a lot of mistakes that were made by entrepreneurs, but we have them. So the mathematical solution assumes that we can throw all these capital goods away and start from scratch. And Mises says, no, you need a market. In the mathematical solution, there are no profits and losses. Okay? All prices are equal to costs, and you get the right quantities. But in the real world, that is not the case. And then finally, Mises criticized the last solution, the trial and error method. He said, this is playing, he called it playing market. This is like children playing market, making up rules about prices. Okay? He said that, in fact, he had already won the debate because the fact they were talking about market socialism meant that they believed you needed a price system. Okay? In fact, one of the economists that came up with the market socialism solution, his name was Oskar Lange. He went on to become a Polish central planner. He said that there should be a statue built to Ludwig von Mises in one of the Polish institutes. I don't remember if it was the Central Planning Board or wherever, because he raised an important problem, but we have solved this problem by the trial and error method. It's interesting, though, when Lange got into power in Poland, he did not institute a mathematical solution. He did not institute the trial and error method. He tried to use computers and he used gross output planning. Okay, so he didn't. So he just went back to the Soviet style. So all of these artificial methods of aping the market, right, of trying to replicate prices. Even the socialists themselves didn't use it. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you.